Well, hello, and welcome to The Difference Makers. I'm your host, Jacqueline Grant, and we are here for a special edition for those of you who are experiencing stress. The question is, who's not experiencing stress these days in a global pandemic? We all have various levels of stress that we're dealing with. Even if we feel that it's not a big deal, maybe if we feel that we've managed it, it's not something that's of concern, you never know how that stress is building up within you. So we have our guest for today who is going to explain about stress management and how we can use various techniques, strategies, and different ways of really just handling that stress so that we manage it instead of it managing us. So I'd like to bring to the virtual stage our guest for today, who is Ann Morrison. Let me introduce her and share a bit about her experience so that you know exactly where she is coming from. Let me pull up her. We've lost her introduction. Let's see. You know, this is live TV, live LinkedIn. We are here LinkedIn live. We're here live on LinkedIn. We're here live on Facebook, and we are also on YouTube. So here's Ann Morrison. In her private therapeutic work, she helps her clients with a wide range of issues from stress management to fear of public speaking. She also coaches other women therapists who want to create a sustainable and thriving therapy practice of their own. Ann has worked many years in the charity and not-for-profit sector as a fundraiser, manager, and trainer. While working full-time, she has also studied and obtained her MBA through the Open University Business School. As a fundraiser, Ann has become more and more interested in what makes people tick. And since 1999, she's successfully trained as a coach, NLP master practitioner, and clinical hypnotherapist. She loves to know a number of different ways of working with people because she works with a variety of different types of people. She has been a catalyst for change and business owners, staff, and managers of large public sector organizations. And although already working remotely with international clients, she totally pivoted her therapy and coaching business to work remotely during COVID-19. She is successfully continuing to help all of her clients to make positive changes in her life, in their lives. And I want to bring to the virtual stage my guest for today, Ann Morrison. Ann, welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Well, you're a wonderful person, and we want to know all the details of, number one, how are you making a difference in the world today with your gifts and talents and abilities?
Well, I suppose it's helping people to understand and change how they think about themselves, their attitudes to themselves, and also to learn techniques and also other ways of managing stress or other fears and situations that they might have experienced in their lives, and also helping them to tap into those inner resources that we all have and often forget about.
We often forget about. So what are some of the things that most come up, especially during these times of COVID-19?
Well, a lot of people who have had perhaps stress in their lives before COVID were sort of perhaps managing, but then COVID changed, the whole ballpark. There was that sort of low level anxiety there and worry about what was going to happen, whether you could go to work, whether you couldn't. Those people who had to work, like those in the frontline NHS staff and other staff who were continuing to work, like shop workers and people like that, they had to go into that every day. And some of them didn't have the PPE equipment that medical people would maybe have had. And that can increase things. I was working with, I work as a volunteer for an organization here in the UK that was set up specifically to work with frontline staff. And some of those early people coming in last year were, they were like paramedics who were worried about taking the infection home because obviously it could be on their uniforms, and they were sort of stripping off as soon as they got in and into a shower and then getting changed. So all those sort of things have added to the concern, as well as, people not being able to see family members who are perhaps in care, all those sorts of things.
So now that we've been in this more than a year, almost 2 years now, how do you feel people are adjusting as far as, are we taking the same precautions that we did in the beginning, whether we're vaccinated or not? do you feel people are kind of just relaxing a little bit?
I think some people are, in a way, we've adapted to that normality of not being able to go out. Certainly here in the UK, not being able to go out and having to, wear masks and keeping each other apart. And now things start to open up. That actually is a lot about, certainly over the last couple of years, that sort of uncertainty has been there because, this was a totally new experience.
Totally new for everyone, So who are the types of people that you usually work with? I know in the introduction we touched on a few segments, but for example, with those who maybe have children, how do you work with those who are managing not only their own stress and anxiety, but having to manage the stress and anxiety of their children?
Well, a lot of the work that I do, although there are certain techniques that I can help change how they react and respond to things, if it's about how they interact with others, then it's often having a conversation about, how they talk about things, how they express things. So it might be, taking time to listen to that child or those children. Perhaps also, although it's difficult in this 24/7, always on environment that we're in, to monitor and manage the child's exposure to the news, to, articles and things and like that, because, in a way, a child isn't equipped to deal with the things as an adult is. So it's about managing that. It's not about censoring it, but it's about managing to an age appropriate situation. And it's just allowing them to express their fears and their worries, because, rather than say, oh, but it won't happen, it's okay, it'll be fine. Sometimes that isn't reassurance enough. They actually need to be able to discuss things. Well, what would happen if, Granny died, or what happened if Mummy and Daddy got ill, and things like that. And sometimes actually having that conversation, although it's difficult, can be helpful. And there are lots of resources out there that people can refer to, books by family specialists who can give advice about dealing with these different types of issues.
Yes, that's very true, because sometimes talking about that elephant in the corner of the room actually can bring more comfort than ignoring it.
Yeah.
So what would you say would be, let's say, your top tips of stress management and what we can do to manage it much better?
Well, I think one of the things about stress is it's our bodies responding properly to feeling threatened. And we often forget about that. I think nowadays, because in a lot of cases our lives aren't exposed to actual threat. I mean, I know some people that are still living in those sort of situations, but generally, certainly in our societies, we're able to walk down the street without getting bombed and all these sort of things generally. But our fight and flight response, which is our natural survival mechanism, in fact, we wouldn't have survived as human beings if we hadn't had that. True. And all animals have it. And when we're being chased by lions, our adrenaline is released, our cortisol is released, and we're just going to get the heck out of there or try and fight. And our adrenaline is released, and then it comes down once it's used up. What happens in our situation generally now, those stresses are perhaps more the manager who is piling work on you, or the kid that's driving up the wall, or fear of redundancy, or something like that. And in a way, our brain and our neural networks, our nervous system, in a way, doesn't know the difference between us being chased by a lion and those more invisible threats.
That's an interesting way to put that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, so in a way, our stress response is actually our ancient survival mechanism coming in. And actually, sometimes realizing that can help you manage it. Because you can say, okay, well, that's my body being normal. The heart beating faster, the sweaty palms, the funny feeling in your tummy, the shorter breathing is actually what we need to have in order to get away from that lion. But because we can't run away, we then, if someone starts to feel that their heart's beating really quickly and starts to worry about that, and they think they're having a heart attack, that's also then perceived as a threat, which triggers that response even more. So it becomes like a self-perpetuating, worsening situation, because we're worrying and that's interpreted as a threat, and then we're worrying about that getting worse, and then that becomes worse.
So is there a strategy or system that you use with your clients to help them to manage that, or to identify it appropriately so they don't think it's something else that it really may not be?
Well, sometimes just having this conversation like I'm now, explaining in a way what's happening, can help them go, oh, yeah, thank goodness I'm not having a heart attack, or, you know, it's a normal thing to experience. Yes, it feels uncomfortable, but it's because we're not using it up. Now, the difficulty comes, or the challenge comes, when those pressures are mounting up like they have done over, you know, the last few years and perhaps before then. And so simple techniques like deeper breathing can help. You know, breathing down into your belly, the belly breath, the slower, deeper in and out breath. If you may have panic attacks, you know, they often say about breathing into a brown paper bag. Well, how many of us carry a brown paper bag?
Do they even exist anymore?
No, that's right. So actually, you know, just putting your hands over your mouth and your nose can help, because when we are having a panic attack, we are getting actually too much oxygen into our body. So we need to balance that because we're hyperventilating. And so actually breathing like that allows us to get to balance.
So do our masks help us with that?
Well, they can do. Yes, they can, because in a way they're sort of helping with that. So that's one thing. The deeper breathing can help, because that balances our two parts of our nervous system, brings it back more into the sort of more rest and relaxation part of our nervous system. Other techniques that I'll use with people might include changing that old response for a preferred response. And there's a specific process that I use for that. It's called brain working recursive therapy. In the States, it's called brain working recursive technique. And there are a few practitioners in the States. And in a way, what we do, we sort of, if someone has had an experience which has been frightening, we can stop that response. In fact, you can just do it sort of by breathing in and stopping it, and then imagining a different response, and almost imagining you're walking out of that into this preferred response. And actually, that something simple as that can help. There's a bit more to the actual whole technique, but that's one thing that people can try for themselves.
Is that similar to like pattern interruption? It's
sort of a pattern interrupt, but it works in a different way from NLP. And you know, with NLP, it is often about the pattern interrupt, or it's about reframing your experience. So rather than thinking of it as a stressful situation, in fact, there's been research showing that when people think of it being courageous, although a lot of the physiology is the same, their actual reaction is different, and therefore that also generates a different response in them. So, you know, changing our thoughts in some way can be helpful. You know, often people say, well, I shouldn't distract myself. I shouldn't, you know, I shouldn't go and do something. Well, actually, taking your mind off this thing that is you're thinking about, which is creating the stress response in you, can be helpful. And sometimes actually just doing something. I remember having a client a few years ago, well, before COVID, but he had a number of stressful situations, and he'd worked this out for himself. He said, well, actually, I've found that if I just go and do something, even though I don't particularly want to do it, that actually makes me feel better. And so he discovered that for himself, and that's really useful. Writing stuff down can be helpful, just to get the thoughts out of the head. You know, if you're lying awake at night worrying about stuff, have a notepad and just write stuff down. And then you can say to yourself, well, actually, I've caught that now. You know, let me go to sleep and I'll think about it tomorrow. It's almost having that change in how you talk to yourself.
And more control. More control over your thoughts.
Yeah.
So, Anne, tell us a little bit about maybe a client that you've worked with that was in a particular situation before they met you. They met you and worked with you. And what was their situation afterwards?
Okay, well, there's one example comes to mind. She was a young woman who, whilst at work, had a response to something. She worked with children, and there was something happened, and this reminded her of a situation that she'd been through. In fact, she had ended up being, she'd gone to a nightclub, and she'd ended up getting raped in that nightclub. She hadn't told anyone for 10 years.
Wow.
She had reported it to the police, but nothing really had happened. And this was sort of 10 years ago. And something had happened that had somehow triggered this old memory for her. And that's what can happen to us. And that's why sometimes we can react in situations that seems totally illogical to that situation, but it's because the brain's made a connection to something that happened in the past that perhaps hasn't been resolved. And so we worked for 6 sessions and on different aspects to do with the rape. We worked on the whole event, and then we reduced that, and then we worked on different elements that were still sort of scoring, because one of the things that's helpful to do is to get some sort of idea of what the score is and how uncomfortable or disturbing it is. Mm-hmm. And by the 6th session, she actually she was like, oh, it happened.
So in your professional opinion, how much of it was actually releasing and talking about it versus maybe something else that may have been going on that caused her to be stuck in that time frame?
I think a bit of both. As she hadn't really talked about it and told people about it, there was always that fear that someone would find out and what that might mean or how they might judge her, because that, whilst it wasn't her fault, often with rape and that type of situation, it can be, they're to blame. And then also some of the techniques that I use were able to help change her response to those situations. So she was able to, in a way, recognize that yes, it had happened, but a bit like EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reprogram, which is often used for trauma cases, but I was using BWRT instead because I was working online. It sort of disconnects the emotion from the memory, and that allows the processing to happen. So it sort of takes its place in the past where it belongs, and it doesn't then affect current or future behaviors in quite the same way.
So how is she now? Where is she now? Not physically, but where is she in life now?
Well, as far as I know, she's getting on and okay and managing COVID and back at work and things like that. Obviously, it's not, we don't necessarily keep in touch with clients once we finish working with them. So as a therapist, you get used to not necessarily knowing how the person is, and you hope not to see them again because their issues are resolved. So yes, but certainly when we had finished that session and I was comfortable enough and she was comfortable to recognize that yes, those things had been resolved, and that was sufficient for where she was at that time, and she would be able to get on with her life okay.
Well, that's great. And I'm sure you've had similar successes with many of your other clients as well. So you've mentioned a number of different techniques and using various acronyms. Could you go through some of the techniques and the acronyms that you've listed, just for those who may not always be so familiar, or maybe it's called one thing in the UK and called something else here, just so that we can be familiar with what is available to us?
Well, certainly, I know hypnotherapy and things is regulated differently in the States from how it is in the UK. Mm-hmm. But one of the techniques I mentioned there was actually developed, I think, by an American, which is the eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And that's when you actually use the eye movements. So the person follows your finger movements, or some more advanced therapists use like a bar with light on it or something. And how that works is that, again, it reprograms the patterns and the connections. It allows the brain to process, or the theory behind it is that it allows the brain to process the event, a bit like REM sleep, when the rapid eye movement when we're sleeping. And that can resolve and let go of the stuck emotion or the held emotion. So that's EMDR. And the other one I mentioned was brain working recursive therapy, which is saying in the UK can be called a therapy, but in the States it's called a technique. And that was developed by a gentleman called Terence Watts, who's a very experienced therapist, and it's sort of based on how the brain processes information and how it stores information. Mm-hmm. And again, it's sort of changing that connection as the old response starts to fire. We stop it and we put a different response in its place. That's the theory. We haven't got the EEG readings to see whether that's actually happening in reality, but that's how we think it's happening.
So who are the people that you love to work with? Who really is your sweet spot of your favorite types of clients?
There's lots of different ones. Mm-hmm. I work, as I say, mainly with people with stress, and that could be anything from fear of public speaking to, other phobias and things like past trauma. I think in a way I probably get more satisfaction from people who've experienced past trauma and then can lead their lives, in a more helpful way.
Mm-hmm.
However, having said that, it's equally as great to hear that someone's managed to, fly on holiday, having had 2 delays in the flight and the journey taking them 23 hours, and they've done it with no bother at all.
Now that's an accomplishment.
Yeah.
So when someone comes to work with you, what is the step before that lets them know they need to seek assistance and why you are the best person to work with them?
Well, sometimes people will have, like the young woman I was talking about, have an incident that maybe might trigger a reaction, and they realize, oh, hang on, I thought this had gone, I need to do something about it. And they'll perhaps look on, directories or whatever, and find me, and they'll contact me and we'll have a chat, and then if they want to go ahead, we'll book sessions in. Other times it will be word of mouth referrals from happy clients, from satisfied clients. They'll refer people to me, which is great. And again, we'll have a chat before booking any session, just to make sure that I can work with them, and they feel comfortable working with me, because that's one of the, you have, if you're going to open your experiences up to someone, you need to be able to feel that you can relate to them and feel comfortable. In fact, I had one person a few years ago, when I asked them why they'd chosen me, said, "Oh, I liked your smile in your photograph." So
it's interesting that you say that, because if you know, I do coaching related to LinkedIn, and your profile picture is so important. I usually say you want it from the shoulders up, because you want people to be able to see your eyes and your smile, because they are meeting you for the first time. And if you are using LinkedIn to gain new clients, or as a mechanism for gaining new clients, you're meeting your client for the first time. So you want to be as you would be when you meet them in person for the first time. So that's a very important point. Thank you for that. One of the other things that you brought up in our time prior to this actual show is the fact that you also help train other therapists. Can you tell us a bit about that for those who are aspiring coaches and therapists out there that would like to get some insight into the world of coaching with the number of years of experience that Anne has had?
So it's not training them to be a coach or a therapist, because that other schools do that. Really, what it is, it's about helping them with the business aspects of therapy. So
very important. Yes.
Well, yes, because and even if you've had previous business experience, it's very different when you're working for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're first starting out, or as you're building your business, you are it. You're the tea maker, plus the receptionist, plus the therapist, plus anything else that might be needing to happen, the IT expert and things like that. So sometimes that can feel a bit overwhelming. And it can also, if you are, if you're moving from a place where you've worked in an organization and you've perhaps done your training, and then you've been working evenings or weekends, and then you decide to go full-time self-employed, and then you are on your own, that can also be difficult for people sometimes to adjust to. And whilst you may be working with clients, maybe 3 or 4 or 5, 6 clients a day, it's a slightly different relationship from what you would have with a colleague, meeting them at the coffee stop or whatever, and having a chat about the weather or what you've done that night. And so there is that sense, that difference too. And also costing your services. A lot of therapists don't like to charge a lot of money because they're in the caring profession, yet they also need to live. And so we address those money mindsets and things as well.
So you give support in so many different ways. You give the business support, you give the camaraderie of, you are coming along the path I've already walked, and I can give you advice and guidance and support and a listening ear, which is so important. We all crave that support from someone who's doing what we are striving to do. So thank you for doing that on behalf of your industry and your fellow practitioners, and that's tremendous. So you've talked about clients, you've talked about your your practitioners that you support. How can people get in contact with you if they'd like to know more?
Well, they can connect through LinkedIn or through Facebook, or through, for the therapy side, my website's annemorrison.co.uk. And for the coaching side, it's annemorrisoncoaching.com, and Anne with an E.
Anne with an E, got it. And what would you like to say as a closing thought to those who are watching maybe on replay and they're not here live to make a comment or a question? What would you say to them as a closing comment to give them that bit of encouragement and support?
Generally, I think that people are too hard on themselves. And sometimes a way of taking a different perspective on that is to think, okay, well, if a friend was in my situation, what would I be saying to them? And I don't, by that mean, I don't mean sort of saying, oh, it's okay, it'll get better. I mean, what would you actually say? So if someone was looking for advice or was in this situation, what would I say to them? Because actually, we generally do know. I remember saying this a few years ago when I was working with a client, and she was, one of her fears was about if her parent died, how would she organize a funeral? That sounds a bit weird, but there was a context around that. And I said to her, okay, well, if a friend had to organize a funeral for her parent, what would you tell her to do? And she was able to tell exactly what she should do. But she hadn't realized in the middle of that feeling of, ooh, what do I do, that she actually did know. And I think that happens to a lot of us.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, because one thing that may come as a surprise to some people is the fact that whether you're a coach, a therapist, a counselor, whatever it may be, coaches need coaches, therapists need therapists. You cannot see your own blind spots. And it's that other person that can see your blind spots that can help you through any challenges that you may go through. So even if you are the best in, let's say, in a sport, whatever sport it may be, if you are the top of your sport, you have coaches because you cannot see for yourself what a coach can see for you. So thank you for being that support to your industry. Anne Morrison, thank you so much for being here on The Difference Makers. And I appreciate you because you make a difference to me.
Thank you, Jacqueline.